Okay, gang. And spotlight. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So hopefully I can track everything. So this will match what I'm saying, and then I just have to keep an eye on people who are coming in and out of Zoom and try and manually change my slides on Zoom. Okay. So welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum. Slightly scatty as always. We have fun with our technology always here. Tonight's Centenary series on the War of Independence, of course, deals with July 1921. And I was just saying, you know, it was a very, very eventful month, because not only do you have the truce, but you have the talks with De Valera. And this is such a momentous event, really, because I suppose, you know, these talks and the failure maybe to reach consensus is, you know, kind of setting us up for what happens in the fall and winter of 1921. And it's very, you know, it's kind of very difficult, I suppose, to then go into fall and winter of 1921 without kind of knowing what has happened in July, obviously, and sort of maybe understanding that what De Valera thought he was going to get, you know, had already been rejected. And so you kind of wonder about the relations in the fall and winter. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So on July 11th, the Irish War of Independence came to an end, and the gun was temporarily
The audio is, we lost the audio for some reason.
I don't know, can they hear me?
Yeah.
It's okay now? Oh yeah, good.
The first.
Okay, maybe I might have covered my microphone. So I'll just go back a sentence or two. I'm saying Sinn Féin saw the truce as a validation that their military and political campaigns had been legitimate. For the IRA, the truce meant that what the English had called a gang of murderers was now officially an army. So last month we talked about Smuts and the King's speech at the opening of the Belfast Parliament, and how that kind of helped, you know, move along this ceasefire, which had really been sort of in the works since about the January of 1920, when a whole new team had been assembled in Dublin Castle. By early July, it was clearly time to talk peace, and even Lloyd George had formally acknowledged it, as had the Unionist leaders in the North. I suppose they were kind of feeling a bit more confident because the Northern Irish Parliament had in fact opened. But there was questions and concerns about how to choreograph the end of hostilities and how to get Eamon de Valera or somebody from Ireland over to London for peace talks. Don't forget, de Valera had been arrested very briefly in June and released on the say-so of Andy Cope. Now, the first week of July, and it's interesting because, you know, we're talking here about the peace talks and how sort of inevitable they are, but actually there were some terrible assaults and ambushes across the country in July, in Sligo, Waterford, Armagh and Cork, all of which saw fatalities between IRA soldiers, British forces and civilians. On the 1st of July, in a quiet bog in Sligo here, the Colleen's ambush, upwards of about 35 members of the North Mayo Brigade of the IRA ambushed a patrol of RIC men, killing 2. British reinforcements arrived and discovered the bodies, and they fired indiscriminately at really what was hundreds of townspeople in the nearby bog who were cutting their turf. It was the height of the summer. There was a lot of children off school helping, and, you know, mercifully only some donkeys and ponies were killed in the process. Tensions were very high in the north of Ireland. Tensions were very high in the north of Ireland, because the Northern Ireland Parliament had opened to tremendous fanfare with King George V. Gone the wrong way. King George V. This thing isn't working for me. Sorry, hang on 1 second, Zoom.
Technology,
It's stopping. Is that working now? No, we're perfect. Yeah, okay, we're caught up. So the monarch's speech was very conciliatory. I said that in tone, and he kind of reached out about the hands of friendship and all that. The security operation that accompanied him, of course, was a forceful demonstration of British state power in the new Northern Ireland. And of course, then the spectacular ambush by the IRA of the troops' train returning after the showpiece, which again we discussed last month, caused international and sort of embarrassing headlines for the British government. The military service pensions collection show that members of the Clockgog IRA in the north were involved in scouting for the Ardavoyle attack. That was the attack on the train. Thomas and John O'Reilly were members of that company. They were two young IRA people who had possibly been involved with helping to bomb that train after the King's visit. There is very little indication that these O'Reillys were like active members or even that they were fully involved, but we know that they were members. Their father, John, was a retired RIC officer, and he was most likely unaware that his sons had anything to do with the IRA. I just want to see, have I... No, I seem to have misplaced my slide, but we'll come back to that. So somebody in the local community was aware of the political sympathies of the sons, the O'Reilly sons, and passed that knowledge on to a group of men who visited the former policeman's house on the night of July 6th. They called themselves military men, and they said they were searching for arms. They seemed to certainly have some kind of training. They knew what they were doing. They were very thorough, but they were not in uniform. The father, John O'Reilly, told the intruders that he was an ex-RIC officer and that there was nothing illegal in his house. They broke down the front door, demanding entrance to the house. Bridget O'Reilly, who was also a school teacher in the state system, suspected something was amiss, and she said, if you were military, you would not do this to us. Her Republican sons were taken from the house for questioning, apparently by the military. The worried parents dressed and went to Newry police station to check on their son's welfare, and they were told at the barracks that no new prisoners had been brought in that night. So, of course, this naturally heightened their concern. The same night at 4:30 in the morning, their neighbour's house, James McQuaid, was also targeted by what seems to have been the same military party. He was also a retired RIC head constable, and his son Willie was also an IRA volunteer. Willie had a friend, Patrick Quinn, who was staying over that night. So Quinn and Willie MacDade were taken into custody. Quinn's sister-in-law was due to give birth to twins, and she was also staying at the house. They shot through the door because the family wouldn't open the door to these men, and Patrick Quinn was killed. And later on, Patrick's sister-in-law lost the twins that she was carrying, and his father, Luke, collapsed and died. And the family blamed the trauma of both of these events on the night's events. Other houses in the same locality were raided that night at 3:45. The McGinnity home was targeted, again known to be a Republican in outlook. Charlie McGinnity was the high-profile kind of member of the family, but his sister Margaret and brother Peter, who was only 19, were also sort of involved with the Republican movement. So Peter, the youngest child, was taken. His mother said, "What do you want with him? He's only a child." And she followed the military personnel out as they led her son away in the transport. The vehicle left the family, most of them praying, inside the house. Margaret, the sister, ran up the road and because she heard a volley of shots. She found her brother lying dead with a cigarette in one hand and a box of matches in the other, and alongside him were the dead bodies of the two O'Reilly brothers, their neighbours. So these houses were targeted because they were the homes of Republicans. Certainly the names of the men appeared on IRA membership rolls, but it is interesting that two of the houses targeted belonged to Catholic RIC officers, and this does seem to indicate, local intelligence. This shows you the growing and uneasy relationship in parts of Ulster between the, at one point, mostly Catholic Royal Irish Constabulary and the exclusively Protestant Ulster Special Constabulary, which had now kind of come to fore in the north of Ireland now that the Parliament up there was open. So was there distrust among the Ulster Special Constabulary of the sort of Catholic force? The local IRA certainly seemed to think so. So the truce was formally agreed following negotiations between General Macready, head of the British forces, Eamon de Valera, Cathal Brugha, Robert Barton and Eamon Duggan in Dublin's Mansion House on July 8th. Both sides agreed to an end to armed attacks, arrests, destruction of property, or to any provocative displays, and it was to come into effect on midday of July 11th, so 3 days later. There was no release of prisoners and there would be no evacuation of Crown forces. The IRA Chief of Staff, Richard Mulcahy, dispatched the following message to all IRA battalions. In view of the conversations now being entered into by our government with the government of Great Britain, and in pursuance of mutual conversations, act as from noon, Monday, 11th of July. Quite peremptory, apparently some of the IRA were not expecting to get that sort of blanket statement, cancelling all hostilities. And of course, this truce does not end the violence overnight, really. So on the same day, this boy, Dennis Spriggs, was taken from his home in Cork and killed by British forces. Now, an interesting thing about the Cork killings by the IRA or by the Black and Tans is that not a single member of the IRA in Cork was killed fighting in action against British forces. All of the 21 IRA members who were killed in Cork by British forces were unarmed at the time of their deaths and were either killed in their homes by masked assassins, shot dead on the street by British patrols, or killed while in custody and allegedly trying to escape. And Dennis was the 9th unarmed Irish prisoner allegedly trying to escape while killed. So that's him. Why is this not moving on for me? Yeah. Okay. In the north, where loyalists feared a sellout of their position, as Belfast IRA officer Roger McCorley acidly remarked, the truce only lasted 6 hours. In fact, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, the day before the 11th, the 10th of July, was known as Belfast's Bloody Sunday because of the intense violence that was there. But most fighting in Ireland did cease and the way was open for negotiations. So that last day, the 10th, in Belfast was marred by bloodshed. 22 people lost their lives, including children, pensioners and innocent passers-by. 80 people were seriously injured and about 1,000 were left homeless. The deaths came during an intense and extremely violent bout of sectarian rioting, which began at midnight on Sunday and did not stop until the afternoon of Monday the 11th. Now, you have to understand too the situation in the north. Of course, the annual 12th of July commemorations are being, kind of gotten ready, which is the height of the Protestant marching season. Belfast frequently saw sectarian attacks rise at this time of the year anyway, but tensions were very high, of course, in 1921 because the new border was not long in place and the Parliament had just opened. And the idea that Britain was doing a deal with the IRA or with the Irish government, wondering would the partitioned government still exist, all of this caused anger and anxiety within the unionist communities. And on the 9th of July, an IRA gang opened fire on this man here, a Royal Irish Constabulary patrol in Raglan Street in Belfast. Constable Thomas Conlon was shot dead and 2 other RIC men were wounded. The ambush was followed by hours of tit-for-tat gun attacks between police, IRA and snipers from both loyalist and nationalist areas. The victims were from, various age groups. There was kind of no serious threats, but they were just caught in the crossfire. So a 12-year-old Protestant, William Baxter, was shot dead as he walked to Sunday school. A 13-year-old Catholic, Mary McGowan, who was partially sighted, was crossing the road with her mother when she was shot. Catholic ex-soldiers were among the victims, and an elderly widower, Bernard Monaghan, who was shot dead on his doorstep on Abyssinia Street. He was a former British serviceman, the father of 13, whose wife had died earlier, and at least 8 of his children had died. And he was just standing at his doorway looking out, Snipers were very common in those days. They suspected that there might have been a sectarian motive for this man's killing because gunmen knew people living in certain areas were likely to be of one religion or the other. But, a lot of eyewitnesses didn't really discuss the events. There was heavy fighting all throughout the city. And the IRA records later on told the Irish Bureau of Military History that the city centre was swept by rifle and machine gun fire. Every weapon which we had in our possession was in action that day. So again, you know, it was this policy of reprisal and retaliation. One person that was, you know, these people were killed, then the British soldiers come out. And so more than 80% of the RIC members were Catholic in 1921. And even now, Unionists in the North were starting to distrust that force, even as they were targeted by the IRA. So Unionists and Protestants felt a little bit more protected by the Ulster Special Constabulary, but they did earn very quickly a reputation for violent indiscipline. Uniformed officers regularly attacked Catholic neighbourhoods in revenge for earlier IRA attacks. Reprisals by police were justifiable and right in the eyes of God and man, says this man, Frederick Crawford, who was the Special's South Belfast District Commandant in 1921. So for all of this violence across the country, and particularly up in the north, on Monday, July 11th, most of the guns did fall silent. IRA commanders like Ernie O'Malley must have been bemused by the sudden end to hostilities, but the response of the general population, it seems clear, was actually elation. In Tralee, for instance, which had been, you know, besieged by, and literally under siege by the Black and Tans at one point, the townspeople took to the streets, letting off rockets in celebration. The ex-soldiers band played Irish national airs, and the populace cheered wildly. IRA men, who a day earlier might have been shot on sight, traded good-natured banter with the Black and Tans. One activist in the town, Christy O'Grady, noted grumpily in his diary that Sinn Féin colours were prominently worn, and by people whom I never saw very fond of it before. So everyone is kind of getting in on the spirit of things. This picture is some of the Belfast damage done after Belfast. And there's the people waiting. So Dublin was reported to be calm rather than ecstatic, but everyone noticed immediately the complete disappearance from the streets of military and police lorries and armoured cars. One Republican in Kingstown, which is now Dunleary, hoisted the Irish tricolour over his yacht in celebration. British troops rode out to tear the flag down, but they were ordered to put it back up by their officers, and a great crowd cheered on the pier. Now on the same day, which was the 10th of July, in Clonmel, the IRA came to the Dillon house looking for a man who was believed to be an informer. Accounts vary. Some people say that a pot of dirty water was thrown out of a window, which kind of, you know, encouraged somebody to take a shot. But whatever happened, this young girl, 15-year-old Bridget Dillon, I've misnamed her, Bridget Dillon, was shot. So on the 8th of July, Eamon de Valera wrote to David Lloyd George, "Sir, the desire you express on the part of the British government to end the centuries of conflict between the peoples of these two islands and to establish relations of neighbourly harmony is the genuine desire of the people of Ireland. I have consulted with my colleagues and secured the views of the representatives of the minority of our nation in regard to the invitation you have sent me. In reply, I desire to say that I am ready to meet and discuss with you on what basis such a conference as that proposed can reasonably hope to achieve the object desired. I am, sir, faithfully yours, Eamon de Valera." So de Valera went to London accompanied by Robert Barton, Erskine Childers. I'll come back to her, and I'll come back to all of these. Yeah, here they are. Okay. So accompanied by Robert Barton, who would go again in the fall, don't forget, Erskine Childers, Arthur Griffith, again, who would go in the fall, Count George Plunkett, Austin Stack, who was very vociferously against the treaty in the end, and he's the man, you can see him here in the back, that's Austin Stack. There. Kathleen O'Connell and Lawrence O'Neill. Eamon de Valera and David Lloyd George met 4 times at number 10 Downing Street between the 14th of July and the 21st. While in London, de Valera also met Sir James Craig on the 15th and 18th of July, but of course nothing came of those. Now, as for the talks themselves, the best source, actually, even though there are official diaries and letters and all of that, and records, of these tense and ultimately fruitless meetings between Lloyd George and de Valera come from an unlikely source. Frances Stevenson was secretary, mistress, and eventual wife to Lloyd George. She was an accomplished diarist, and her private papers, as well as his own archive, of which she was the custodian, augmented the official British records of his entire political career, really. She had met him in 1911, Lloyd George, when she was 22, and she was initially employed as a governess in the home. And then in 1913, she became his secretary. Until his wife died in 1941, they had a relationship, they were absolutely together. And then he married her when Lloyd George was 80. So her diaries are obviously laced with intimate indications of mood and gossip and kind of all the detail that you don't get in a more, sterile, authentic or official diary. So we know what Lloyd George thought about these talks about talks. It does tally with the official records that we have, and it's consistent with Lloyd George, his own regular reports to the king about the progress or lack of it, and it often backs up much of what de Valera says himself. Now, the leader of a brittle and discontented Liberal Conservative government, Lloyd George was busy and tired and very weakened by other factors. He had conspirators within his own cabinet, and it was possible that this Irish policy might be used to displace him. And this had been, the problem of various British prime ministers since about 1870. He was embarking on negotiations which would result within 5 months in the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, which the British would deem a success because it finally took the Irish question out of British domestic policies. Now, Lloyd George was a tricky character. He astounded those with whom he was negotiating with his own capacity for a quick change of tack. He was known as the Welsh wizard, extremely agile mentally, probably 2 or 3 steps ahead of everybody else, and not one to leave himself exposed. So I'm going to kind of quote extensively from Stevenson's diary now. On July 12th in 1921, Stevens noted that Lloyd George was going down to Chequers tomorrow to have a conference with Austen Chamberlain. A.J. Balfour and some others were also going to attend, ahead of the Sinn Féin delegates arriving. Lloyd George, interestingly, liked to include his critics and any potential rivals in formulation of any policies, because if there were to be quicksand in the negotiations, Lloyd George did not want to be there alone. Smuts was also invited to talk, and he told the British ministers that he had advised de Valera that the best plan would be for an initial private meeting between the two leaders. He characterised the Irish negotiators as totally inexperienced. Now, this is Smuts, who was on the Irish side, don't forget, and in a state, quote, of extreme nervousness about negotiating with so distinguished a statesman as Lloyd George. How much of that is flattering Lloyd George, how much of it is an accurate reading of the situation, it's kind of hard to tell at this stage. Quote, the first object was to remove these not unnatural apprehensions and to establish a good atmosphere in which to carry out the more formal conferences. He himself, Smuts, felt that the best way of achieving this would be for Mr. Lloyd George to see Mr. de Valera with the least possible formality and to discuss the matter very frankly. It would be desirable for the Prime Minister to allow Mr. de Valera to talk very freely, in fact, to give plenty of tether. Again, this could be a miscalculation for de Valera's, side. So on July 14th, Lloyd George met de Valera for the first time. Stevenson recorded the scene in Downing Street after de Valera had just gone. So here's some kind of press about Sinn Féin's president, as he was called in the British press. And then here's the people waiting outside in London while praying on their knees while these talks are going on. Stevenson recorded the scene in Downing Street after de Valera had just gone, having been with Lloyd George for nearly 3 hours. She noted that she had never seen Lloyd George so excited as he had been before de Valera had arrived at 4:30. He kept walking in and out of my room, and I could see he was working out the best way of dealing with Dev. As I told him afterwards, he was bringing up all his guns. He had a big map of the British Empire hung up on the wall in the cabinet room with its great blotches of red all over it. This was to impress Dev. In fact, Lloyd George told her that his aim was to emphasise to de Valera the greatness of the British Empire and, quote, to get him to recognise it and the king. As she records the direct speech which Lloyd George had used, characterising the empire as a sisterhood of nations, quote, the greatest in the world. Look at this table. There sits Africa, English and Boer. There sits Canada, French, Scotch and English. There sits Australia, representing many races, even Maoris. There sits India. Here sit the representatives of England, Scotland and Wales. All we ask you to do is to take your place in the sisterhood of free nations. It is an invitation, Mr. de Valera. We invite you here. Pretty persuasive rhetoric, you know, in one way. Historian Nicholas Mansura has noticed that de Valera's recollections of this meeting tallied very closely with that contemporaneous record of Stevenson's. Stevenson recorded the complaints from Lloyd George that in these discussions it had been very, quote, difficult to keep to the point, as de Valera had kept going off on a tangent and talking in formulas and refusing to face facts. Adding that whenever de Valera, quote, appeared to be warming, he suddenly drew back as if frightened and timid. Lloyd George characterised him as the man with the most limited vocabulary that he has ever met, which doesn't actually strike me as being particularly something I would have thought about de Valera. You know, he didn't seem someone with a limited vocabulary, but I think next to the Welsh Wizard, we probably all have a limited vocabulary. So this cartoon appeared in Punch, and it's Lloyd George with, you can see the map of Ireland, and up on the table it says the Irish Council, and the little writing says, I proceed to cut this map into 2 parts and place them in the hat. After a suitable interval they will be found to have come together of their own accord. At least let's hope so. I've never done this trick before. So, you know, this idea that the partition was not supposed to be forever, I think is very important, you know, that this is the perception that's out there, that yes, Ulster is, you know, for a little while going to be in, Ireland will be in 2 parts, but not forever. So Stevenson attributed then to Lloyd George direct threats, which appear to have riled de Valera. And this is very important for what happens, I think, in the fall and winter talks. She quotes Lloyd George as saying, terrible as events in Ireland have been, it is nothing to what they will be if we fail to come to an agreement. Lloyd George had instanced recent military successes which had made it possible for Britain to, quote, withdraw our troops from Mesopotamia and Germany and other parts of the world. Lloyd George now hesitated, quote, to think of the horror if war breaks out again in Ireland. At this, de Valera got very excited, complaining that this was a threat of force, of coercion. Lloyd George responded that he was simply forecasting what will inevitably happen if these conversations fail, and if you refuse our invitation to join us. Stevenson nevertheless ended that diary entry with optimism, noting that both leaders seemed to get on well on the whole. And there's again the London Illustrated News, where I love it, you know, the self-styled president of the Irish Republic. So there, you know, he really isn't, I guess, being accepted as such. So there's the delegation again, and here they are, the Irish delegation. Yes, where did I leave off? Yeah, she added then that British information suggested that Sinn Féin was genuinely in earnest, and the fact that the outrages had ceased in Ireland reassured them that de Valera did have authority, and I guess that's an important point too. The 2 leaders would meet again on the following day, Friday, July 15th, but it was Monday before Stevenson made her diary entry. She wrote that Lloyd George's impression was that de Valera, quote, had evidently been afraid he had gone too far at their first meeting, and now he was bent on impressing on David, she just says D, the idea that he had proposed nothing and consented to nothing. She noted that de Valera, quote, had insisted that what the people of Ireland wanted was a republic, and had asked Lloyd George if the name of republic could not be conceded at any rate. Lloyd George had replied that quote, was just what they could not have, that the people of this country would not tolerate it after all that had happened. Lloyd George had then mooted there must be some other word, and since republic was not an Irish word, he asked what was the word for republic in Irish. Public is recorded as de Valera's reply, to which Lloyd George responded that this merely meant people, asking was there not another word. She records Sayre's thought as de Valera's response. Very well, said Lloyd George. Why do you insist upon republic? Sayre's thought, free state, is good enough. To this riposte, Stevenson notes that for the first time de Valera simply roared with laughter. So it's hard to know, you know, what's going on with de Valera. Is he dismissing it outright, or is he kind of accepting, you know, that as a response? She concluded herself that the trouble was, quote, simply going to be Ulster. Lloyd George had already drafted a summary of terms which he proposed sending to De Valera on Wednesday night, which was July 20th, and to which De Valera would reply on Thursday. She noted that Lloyd George had delayed giving the draft terms to De Valera as he, quote, thought the time was not ripe. Stevenson notes that Smuts had seen De Valera and, quote, impressed upon him the great difficulty with Ulster. But she recorded that Smuts was not optimistic because De Valera did not really appreciate that Ulster provided the Lloyd George government with any real difficulty, believing they were, quote, just using Ulster to frighten him. And that is probably the kernel at the heart of everything that happens for the next, 6 months to a year, that maybe De Valera did not believe that Britain really would support, the Unionist government. Even though we've been saying in reality, like, Ulster has existed as a threat or as almost an entity since 1912, She records that Lloyd George had seen James Craig and he found him, quote, quite obstinate, as was his cabinet, who for the most part believed that Lloyd George was trying to use Sinn Féin, quote, to persuade them to concede something. She summarised, the position is tightening a little, and it looks very much as though Ulster would again prove a stumbling block in the settlement. Lloyd George remained a little worried about it, but she believed in his heart of hearts he was bent on settling it, but did not like to appear too confident in case anything may happen. She gave due weight to the brittle nature of his own coalition government. They were, she allowed, lots of people who don't want a settlement and who would be very glad to see him fail. The two leaders were to have their final meeting on Thursday, the 21st of July. On the eve of that meeting, she recorded that matters were, quote, more hopeful with regard to Ireland today. The previous night they had looked black, with De Valera taking exception to a statement made by Craig, in which he had presumed himself to be Northern Ireland spokesman, and that De Valera was confined to representing Ireland south of the new border. Very interesting, difference there. De Valera warned that if Lloyd George shared that view, quote, it was not worthwhile continuing the conversations. Stevenson noted that Lloyd George had replied with a very curt note, saying that he was no more responsible for Craig's views than he was for the statement De Valera had made, to which Craig's statement was a reply. De Valera did not answer, but did not publish the letters, and Smuts saw him this morning, the morning of the last talks, and reports that he is in a better state of mind and not nearly so obstinate. So it just shows you, the level of statesmanship really that Lloyd George is playing at. He has these two leaders in the north and south of Ireland who are fairly, gung-ho about what their role and what their title is and what their expectations are. And he's able to sort of absent himself in a way, like, I'm not responsible for what Craig said and I'm not responsible for what you said. And yet at the same time, he is sort of silently backing the north, So it's a very subtle move that he's doing here. She concluded the diary entry that night, noting that Lloyd George would forward the terms that evening, that he would meet De Valera on the following critical day, and that Lloyd George was getting, quote, very excited about it. The two leaders met for the final time on July 21st, which she records as a not too satisfactory interview. From the first moment when she had seen Lloyd George after the session, she recognised him as, quote, very depressed, and she believed the meeting, quote, had been a failure. De Valera had not even taken the terms away with him. Quote, but we now found this was a mistake, as he has sent for them since. How Irish. So we see again, like, he'd made this big gesture, walked out of the room, didn't bring the document, and then, sent for the document after he was at home or back in his hotel. After De Valera had read the terms, and I'll read you some of the terms in a minute, he told Lloyd George he could not advise his people to accept them. Very well, Mr. De Valera, was Lloyd George's answer, quote, then there is only one thing more left for us to discuss. And when De Valera asked what that was, Lloyd George replied, quote, the time for the truce has come to an end. Lloyd George informed her that at this De Valera had gone perfectly white and had great difficulty in controlling his agitation. He then said that at any rate he would put them before his people and report back. So, brought to the brink of war again, and the answer is, okay, I'll come back to you, I'll talk to my people. So there's a lot of can kicking on both sides, going on. Although Lloyd George had thought that the meeting was, quote, pretty hopeless at the time, she wrote that she was perfectly convinced that De Valera was bluffing. And she was confirmed in this view by everything she had heard since. Quote, we hear they are very pleased with the terms, that they are more than they ever hoped to get, but that, of course, it is only policy to refuse at first in the hope that they may get even more. They have returned to Ireland today, and meantime the Irish papers are behaving very well, and it is evident that the bulk of Irish opinion wants peace. She records Lloyd George as saying that were Sinn Féin to reject the terms, there was only one thing to be done, quote, to reconquer Ireland. She records Balfour as having, quote, squirmed at the cabinet when the terms were discussed preliminary to sending them to De Valera. They were so contrary to all the views the old man had ever held on Ireland. But she concluded that Balfour had given in gracefully, and that Lloyd George had succeeded in having a unanimous cabinet, which was a great achievement. So again, like, he had this delicate balance among his own cabinet as well as the opposition at home, you know, and the partitioned government in the north. So he's keeping all his boats steady, is what I'd say. It is noteworthy that in her diary entry for the 20th of July, she recorded Lloyd George as confiding that, quote, if he settles Ireland, he is prepared to go out of office. He was quite serious about it, as he believed that were he to settle Ireland, he can go no higher, and the rest would do him good. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. So, what was actually offered in the document? Actually, I'll read these first. I hadn't put these into my talk. So these letters are from, you know, De Valera back and forth to Collins. It's an interesting kind of little aside. This was on the 15th, so he probably had met him, you know, once, and he may have even met Carson or Craig at this stage. I'm sure you're anxious to hear whether any important developments have taken place. The position is simply this: Lloyd George is developing a proposal which he wishes me to bring in my pocket as a proposal to the Irish nation for its consideration. The meetings have been between us two alone as principals. Again, very interesting for the tax that's taken in October, you know, when they kind of divide and conquer the Irish delegation. The idea on which we, the ministry, started out on remains unchanged. But, like, that's very easy to say, the ideas remain unchanged when you're not meeting as a group, you know. You will be glad to know that I am not dissatisfied with the general situation. The proposal will be theirs, and we will be free to consider it without prejudice. Hope to see you about the middle of the week. And he's initialed it. We must put back the Dáil meeting. I am writing to Diarmid. Then the next week he sends on the 19th, things may burst up here suddenly, so all should be prepared. So this is one of those black, you know, that he's had this black meeting. I intend adhering to our original plan as closely as possible, but the changes in the situation have to be met as they arise. I expect to be back by the end of the week. And, you know, I suppose there was probably a very real fear. You know, here they are in London. They could have been arrested maybe at any minute, you know, like, would the British honour the truce? Did they really see them as an appointed government? It might have been very easy to arrest them for treason or, you know, whatever jumped up charges the English wanted to charge them with. So maybe they were kind of panicking, you know, that, and I know this was certainly a fear in the fall talks too. Now, this is some of the settlement. I mean, this was a 3 or 4 page document, so I've just put these here, but I want you to see the terms. You know, it's vital to the welfare and safety of both Great Britain and Ireland, forming as they do the heart of the Commonwealth. And of course, the first concern is defence, and that the needs shall be mutually recognised. And this is one of the sticking points in the treaty later on, because they do keep some of the ports. It is essential, it says, that the Royal Navy alone should control the seas around Ireland and Great Britain, and such rights and liberties should be accorded to it by the Irish state as are essential for naval purposes in the Irish harbours and on the Irish coast. So this is one of the things that they fight about later on in Dublin, and here it is being stated, you know. In order that the movement towards the limitation of armaments, which is making progress in the world, should in no way be hampered, it is stipulated that the Irish territorial force shall, within reasonable limits, conform in respective numbers to the military establishments of the other parts of these islands, so reduce the size of the army. So it's almost all defence. While the Irish people shall enjoy complete autonomy in taxation and finance, it is essential to prevent a reoccurrence of ancient differences between the two islands. This is number 5. And in particular, to avert the possibility of ruinous trade wars. With British and Irish governments shall agree to impose no protective duties or other restrictions upon the flow of transport, trade and commerce between all ports. The Irish people shall agree to assume responsibility for a share of the present debt of the United Kingdom and of the liability of pensions arising out of the Great War, the share in default of agreement between the governments concerned to be determined by an independent arbitrator appointed from within the dominions. So to be honest, this is not a whole lot different from the terms of the treaty offered in October through December. You know, it's kind of heartbreaking to see it laid out like that, but, you know, I think the British stick to this pretty strongly. Now, then there's all these other points that they raise, and now they're talking about the north of Ireland. He says the form in which the settlement is to take effect will be, and of course I can't see because there's a Zoom thing over it, something about Ireland herself. It must allow for full recognition of the existing powers and privileges of the Parliament of Northern Ireland, you know, which cannot be abrogated except by their own consent. For their part, the British government entertain an earnest hope that the necessity of harmonious cooperation amongst Irishmen of all classes and creeds, now very interesting, they're calling them Irishmen, even the ones in the north, will be recognised throughout Ireland, and they will welcome the day when by those means unity is achieved. No such common action can be secured by force. Union came in Canada by the free consent of the provinces, so in Australia, so in South Africa. It will come in Ireland by no other way than consent. There can, in fact, be no settlement on terms involving on the one side or the other that bitter appeal to bloodshed and violence which all men of goodwill are longing to terminate. The British government will undertake to give effect, so far as that depends on them, to any terms in this respect on which all Ireland unites, but in no conditions can they consent to any proposals which would kindle civil war in Ireland. Now that document is very important. Is very important in terms of the language. First, and I mean, to be honest, we're running into this today with the Brexit and the deep poll. The British government insists on calling even the Unionists in the North Irishmen. You know, they're calling what would be a sectarian war or, you know, whatever war that devolves in Ireland a civil war. So it sort of seems like that they are not accepting the Northern Irish province as technically a British province. They're calling them Irish, but they are also not willing to, to force them into a union with Ireland. So it's very interesting, the kind of splitting of hairs there. You know, they're literally defining them as Irishmen, but they're also not going to push them against their will. So that's, you know, and it'll just tell you the power that Carson and Craig had in the North, you know. And so again, the British government will leave Irishmen themselves to determine by negotiations between themselves. Again, Irishmen, not Northern Irish or the British in Ireland, or, you know, they're calling them Irishmen. Whether the new powers which the Pact defines shall be taken over by Ireland as a whole and administered by a single Irish body, or to be taken over separately by Southern and Northern Ireland, with or without a joint authority to harmonise their common interests. They will willingly assist in the negotiation of such a settlement if Irishmen should so desire. By these proposals, the British government sincerely believe that they will have shattered the foundations of that ancient hatred and distrust which has disfigured our common history for centuries past. The future of Ireland within the Commonwealth is for the Irish people to shape. So it's kind of masterful in its simplicity, because he's looking like he's giving Ireland all the power, but it seems to be an absolute that Ireland will be within the Commonwealth, you know. So he has kind of sidestepped, in a way, a lot of the responsibility, because he makes it look that it is up to the Irish, you know, themselves to agree among themselves. Taxation, autonomy, appoint its own judges, maintain its own courts of law, army, police force, postal services, education system, and enjoy the comfort of security within the empire. In return, Ireland would be subject to the Crown, concede access to the naval and air forces of the empire, as well as contributing to the funding of such forces. Ireland would also have to accept part of the cost of the Great War and not engage in any trade wars with mainland Britain. So it was on the receipt of this document that De Valera feared. Sorry, there's a little thing here. A cricket, great. If this cricket runs over my foot and I scream, I'm sorry about that. On receipt of this document, de Valera feared that the Irish Republic he and his provisional government had sworn an oath to achieve was now unattainable. He told Lloyd George face to face that the document was totally unacceptable to the Irish people, and on July 21st, Eamon de Valera left Downing Street for Dublin in a black mood. Yeah. So, that is not sort of surprising, I suppose, in a way. In fact, it would be 1 month with their delegation without de Valera, and this time including Michael Collins in October. So I just wanted to show you this. There's the handwritten notes of Eamon de Valera of a meeting of the inner cabinet held on July 24th. Now, what's interesting about this was Michael Collins had given out about him elsewhere, and Lloyd George too, that he was always kind of drawing lines and trying to explain to them with charts and with little circles what he called external association and all of this meant. So I can't really even read these. Like, he says about Craig, our duty now, something to solve, carry on against trouble, I think he says, naturally kept up. So, and he's got all these lists of people, but what's interesting and present at that meeting were Eamon de Valera, Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith, Cathal Brugha, Richard Mulcahy, Owen MacNeill, Erskine Childers and Diarmuid O'Hegarty. Of the present at the meeting, only de Valera, Griffith, Collins, Brugha and MacNeill were actually part of the cabinet. Mulcahy was Chief of Staff of the IRA, Childers was the Substitute Director of Publicity, and O'Hegarty was the Secretary to the Dáil. The meeting is not recorded in the official minutes of meetings, so we just have kind of this scrap of paper. But, it is very difficult, I think, to, not be critical of de Valera going into the fall when this is the result of his talks with Lloyd George. So I'm going to just stop the screen share so that we can open it up and I can see what's happening here on Zoom. So, a bloody month, a lot of violence in the early days. And, I thought those pictures were very effective of the crowds outside the Mansion House waiting, and even the crowds in London, waiting to hear would there be peace. So you can tell, the civilian population are absolutely wrecked, from it. I think and Collins, I should have gone into that a little bit more too. Collins and Mulcahy were butting heads about whether or not the war could continue. Collins was absolutely adamant that they were almost out of ammunition. They were almost out of kind of, spirit. Like, his people were very demoralized, whereas Mulcahy thought they should keep going. So, there's already a split on the Irish team, and it is very apparent that Britain is not going to concede more than what they have already conceded. So does anyone have any questions or comments? I'm just going to quickly kind of check on Facebook too in case there's people there, but I'm here for answers or questions.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can now, yeah.
I was wondering, in the part where you were going through that list of 5 or 6 key points that the de Valera side was interested in, and then when you came back and said what they ultimately got was much the same as the original offer.
Yeah.
What was the kind of thing that they were hoping to get that they didn't get? Or what were they hoping in the offer that wasn't there?
Yeah. De Valera wants no mention, to be honest, of like the Commonwealth or anything like that. So what he proposed, and we'll go into this more when we do the talks themselves in October, he calls it external association. Nobody can really understand it except himself, and they more or less said that to him, that if he had gone and kind of advocated for it, maybe Lloyd George would have found it easier to kind of give in on that point. But they don't really know, what is the difference, because it's little stickler things like they don't want to take the oath of allegiance. I think they don't want any of the ports to be controlled by the British. And of course, the big thing is partition. So they want partition to not exist, but there's no way that that's going to happen, So the salve for that in October and December is the Boundary Commission, where, you know, on the one hand, Lloyd George is telling the Irish that the northern state is so small that it's, quote, economically unviable, and, you know, we'll do this commission and they'll have to come back in. But that, in fact, you know, doesn't happen, because the Boundary Commission results are kind of leaked. Most of the Irish, you know, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, are dead at this point. So the Boundary Commission limps along until 1925, and the border stays the way it was drawn up in 1919. So De Valera, I think, you know, even it was very telling and kind of cynical, I thought, if we're to believe her version of what De Valera said he wanted, you know, can we even have the name Republic, as opposed to like any substance of a republic? I think that's very interesting, that, you know, was it enough for De Valera to be able to kind of whitewash something? You know, he deeply rejects like the oath of allegiance initially, and then a few years later he says, well, it's only an empty formula anyway, which is what, you know, the pro-treaty side had argued, like, we just have to go through this. Nobody means that we were, you know, swearing loyalty to the crown. So I think he just was a hardliner without a fully expressed vision of his own, to be honest, but needed the British to concede something, and the fact that they don't annoys him, is my take, you know, on it, because the British really don't concede between this and December. It's very, very similar, and, you know, he keeps banging on about external association, and there really isn't a difference between external association and dominion status, you know, it's just the name. And yeah, we have a question in the room, so I'll repeat the question in the room for you guys.
That was a follow-up in that. So the talks failed. People goes back to Ireland. So what's his plan then? What did he expect to do?
Yeah, so the question was, the talks failed, De Valera goes back to Ireland, and, you know, what was the plan? What did he expect to do? So they do consult, you know, among themselves, and he draws up all of these other documents. There's a long, protracted discussion among the Irish team about who should go back, and even should they reopen talks. Like, to be honest, there's absolutely no way they can reopen the violence. The momentum is completely gone from the IRA. Even those last few skirmishes, like we said a couple of months ago, like the four courts, that cost them 80 soldiers in Dublin, you know, so they don't have the force that they should have. So a lot of what's done over the summer and getting ready for October is trying to flesh out what exactly he means by external association, and basically trying to convince Michael Collins to go, who actually would have gone in the initial round, because he kind of felt, you know, it was me leading the war that got us to here. By the time October comes, he's actually afraid that he's going to be thrown under the bus and that he'll be arrested, perhaps, you know, when he goes, and that if those talks fail, then they have no backup. You know, like, he'll be in London. They won't be able to start the war without him, because he will literally be arrested in London. Whereas De Valera says, oh, well, we'll have me in the back pocket if the talks fail the next time. So they kind of spend the next couple of months trying to strategize about literally hair splitting, you know, these terms about external association and dominion status, and also really trying to drill down on partition, that how are we going to get the island to not be separated, which, you know, is just a fool's errand, really, because Carson and Craig are ruling, you know, with no intention of not ruling in the future. Is that okay? Anyone else? Anything on Facebook here, or Jack? Anyone on? And hey, George, how are you?
Hi. You know, there are way too many questions because it's such a complicated story, and it's astonishing you can somehow keep up with all this. It
helps to divide it into monthly chunks.
The first is a simple question. You had a newspaper, the Vancouver Times News. Was that Vancouver, Canada?
Yeah, so, you know, this was big news all over the world. I intended to try to get more of those, but it just was one of the easiest ones that popped up without having to go in through, you know, a search engine. So, you know, the rest of the dominions, we'll call them, or the Commonwealth countries, watch with great interest, because maybe what happens in Ireland will have an impact on their own status, you know.
Oh, absolutely. No, I've been to Vancouver, and they have a very strong pro-British aura. I mean... Yeah, they do. Sorry, I'm saying goodbye to somebody here. and my deeper question is, you know, looking at the future, Northern Ireland has is somewhat like the United States in that the majority has shifted.
Yeah.
The population majority has shifted more towards the, native Irish.
Yeah.
As opposed to the invading British. And do you think that's going to have any impact on Brexit?
Well, I mean, that's the $22 million question, or 64 million. You're right, like it's definitely shifting. I think they're still not at quite the majority level, and it has been very interesting to watch it over the last couple of years between Brexit and all these things. The fact that Northern Ireland actually voted to stay in, and yet they kind of got pulled away because Britain voted as a whole to leave. So, there's an interesting kind of dichotomy, I think, in their own psyche at the moment in Northern Ireland, because very like what Lloyd George was saying, a lot of British people don't really count the North as British. They do think that they're Irish. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a tendency to kind of forget that the state is there. Why don't you just join together? And like the DUP are riddled with problems at the moment. They've gone through a leadership change twice in the last year, in the last couple of months even. So it's hard to know what will happen. I think eventually, but it will take more years, for the votes to consolidate. I don't think like that, that the Catholics or what we call them, the Republican, won't necessarily be in power anytime soon, or certainly in a majority parliamentarian wise. But, there certainly is a move. If there's a exit poll or a border poll, would they stay with Ireland because it gives them entrance to Europe? The hardline DUP or the Unionists are still saying no, that they would rather be with Britain. And maybe there's a way for Ireland to come into the Commonwealth. It has really kind of complicated the whole thing. I was listening to a talk at home recently, or a conference at home, and they were saying even the Southern Irish probably haven't thought about this all the way through, because, there's no way the tricolour flag will be acceptable to the Northern Irish community. That, we'd have to change our national anthem. So I think everyone thinks, oh, sure, we'd be very welcoming. We're delighted to have them in. But, our symbols are not even acceptable at this stage. So I'd say we're a longer way off of unity than I thought initially. I thought when Brexit didn't go their way that maybe that would be enough to bring them in. But I think we're still a ways away from a united Ireland, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Or how are we doing on Facebook? No questions on Facebook. Any questions in here? Jack, are you good?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So I don't know what we'll do in August. I'm looking at it. It's a quiet month actually in 1921 as well, which is good. There's a few outbreaks of violence, but we might just skip August and let everyone have their last of the summer evenings to themselves, and hit back in with a bang in September. But I'll be sending out the newsletter in the next couple of days. So if I feel we can squeeze one in, we will. But otherwise, we'll pick it up again in September. And of course, it's going to be hell for leather then between September and December, and then we're into the heaviness of the Civil War. So thanks everyone for joining tonight. It was great to have you, and in person too. We're doing these hybrids, which is now a triple hybrid, because we've got Facebook too. So it can be a bit off-putting at the start, I know, with technology. But I think this hybrid thing is here to stay now, with the numbers going up and stuff as well. We'll have to keep an eye on even opening. So thank you all very much. I don't think we've anything scheduled yet off the top of my head. We are starting a Ulysses reading group. If anybody would like to take part in that, we're going to read one chapter every 2 weeks. So I'll be sending out notifications of that, and it'll be on Facebook too. And then you'll be ready for Bloomsday next July. But that's about all I know for sure we've scheduled. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening, and I'll be in touch.
Terrific composition. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. Take care.